Okay, so today's notes are going to be on ecological succession. And succession is just a series of predictable stages of growth that a forest goes through after a disturbance of some type. There's two types of succession that can occur. They're called either primary succession or secondary succession. Primary succession starts from bare rock. So that is when there is no soil present or the soil has been completely destroyed in an area. And there will be organisms that move in that actually create or put nutrients into the soil, or they break down that rock to kind of start that whole succession process. So the two types of organisms that can actually put nutrients back into the soil and break down rock are called moss and lichens. These are usually carried in by the wind. Their spores are carried in from the wind. And then they attach to the rocks. They actually break down the rock material, turn that rock into soil, put nutrients into the soil, and then they're able to support that ecosystem actually is able to support other types of plant life. And then there's secondary succession, which is when there's a disturbance where the soil has not been disturbed, um, or at least there's nutrients still in the soil, and so plants can still grow. We end up with grasses, sedges, wildflowers, different bushes that all have seeds, are dispersed through the wind or by animals, and then those seeds get into the soil that already, again, has nutrients in it, and then those plants can start growing in that area. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit closer look here at these two concepts. So the first is primary succession. Actually, I'm going to hit the back button here. Let's see if I can get this back to the previous slide. Here you'll see this is actually, since we have bare rock, we would call this primary succession. And so lichens and other pioneer species will move into the area initially. Again, they'll break down that rock, they'll create soil where nutrients can then flow into the soil. Then we end up with some small plants that start to grow, and then some grasses. Again, all of these organisms that first move into an ecosystem to help establish that ecosystem, they're called pioneer species. Then we move into further stages where larger plants start to grow, and we call these organisms that move in the intermediate species. And these things keep growing for years, sometimes even decades, until we get to a point where there's large, well established trees. Usually, those tend to be hardwood trees. And they're very shade tolerant because the seeds of these trees have to grow in the understory of the forest that's already here with this intermediate air, forest. And once these grow and they're a healthy, stable community, we call that a climax community. All right, and then there's secondary succession where we have something like a fire maybe moves in, it wipes out the area. In just a couple of years' time, we'll start to see those pioneer species move in. And then we follow the exact same path as primary succession. So really the major difference here between the two types of succession are those lichen and mosses that move in. We start with bare rock in primary succession. We start with established soil in secondary succession. Okay, so these different stages are characterized by the type of plants that dominate that ecosystem at the time. And that's because different species are actually adapted to the different conditions, growing conditions, in each of the different stages of the ecosystem. So again, pioneer, just to kind of reiterate what I've already said, they kind of come in first when the ground is just bare rock. Characteristics are that the seeds are spread by wind or animals. They're very fast growing. They're very tolerant of shallow soil, and they usually live well in full sunlight because there's no other shade that would actually protect them from drought conditions that they may not be well adapted to survive in. Some examples of these are moss, lichen, wildflowers, wild raspberries, and then, like I said, grasses or sometimes sedges, as those are called. And then we have those mid successional species or the intermediate species. They appear after the pioneer species. And so they move in, and their characteristics again are fast growing. They are larger plants than these pioneer species. Again, sun tolerant shrubs, bushes, fast growing trees like aspen trees, cherry trees, types of coniferous or pine trees will also move in then. And then we have that late successional climax community species that are these appear after the soil has nutrients far down into the soil, and they tend to kill off a lot of those um, pioneer species. We won't see a lot of those pioneer species growing during this time. And we won't see a lot of the mid-successional species. So it's normally when we think of an old growth forest, a forest that's been around for hundreds of years, the plants that tend to live there tend to be those big hardwood trees, oak, hickory, elm, some of those really big maple trees, things like that. All right, and again, you can kind of see if I were to ask you, looking at this picture, which type of succession do we see here? You would notice right away that there's bare rock. So this is going to be primary succession, and this is a really nice picture to show you those stages again. Okay, all right, primary succession occurs in an area that hasn't previously been colonized by plants. Um, and so when I think of things that, or we also say that the soil's been destroyed. So I think of a volcano coming through and just wiping out everything. Or if a glacier maybe moves through during an ice age and totally wipes away the soil, leaving just exposed rock. That's another example of when we can see primary succession occurring. And again, we have those moss and lichen species that move in. They grow directly on the rock. This is actually a symbiotic relationship, a lichen. It's a symbiotic relationship between a moss and algae, where they will actually secrete acids that will break down the rock. And then that's the moss part of the lichen. And then the algae piece will actually use sunlight to go through photosynthesis and put nutrients and things and minerals that are needed back into the soil. Okay, so chemical weathering of rocks by both the moss and the lichen, combined with this organic matter from the moss and lichen dying, will actually form that initial shallow soil. So some nutrients very shallow in the soil, they don't run very deep. So that's why those initial pioneer species move in here. And then secondary succession, again, that occurs in an area that's already has established soil. And but the plant life has just been removed for whatever reason due to some type of disturbance. So again, I right away think of a forest fire coming through and just burning down all of the plants that are in an area. Again, those pioneer species move in. And again, we're going to follow the exact same steps then as we do in primary succession. Okay, some other key terms of organisms that are important to this whole idea of succession would be a keystone species. These organisms are dependent upon by other species in an ecosystem where if they were destroyed, that ecosystem would undergo a dramatic change. They have a very low population density, so there tends to not be very many of these species in an area, but their importance to the entire ecosystem is monumental. So, a prime example of this would be the Yellowstone wolves. They were completely eradicated. Eradicated just means to remove an organism from an area. And so the wolves were eradicated from the park back in the 20s. In the mid 90s, mid to late 90s, they started to reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone National Park, and the entire landscape of the park dramatically changed. We're actually in class the next time I see you. We're going to watch a video about this very topic. So I'll kind of save most of that for the video. But when I say dramatically changed, it wasn't just the type of animals that were impacted in the area, it was also the types of plants as well. And because of the type of plants that we found there, it actually changed the flow of the river in Yellowstone National Park. So not only was it the plants and animals that were impacted, but it was also the geology of the park itself, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so keystone species dramatically impact the ecosystem in which they live. And this is important because let's say that a disturbance happens and wipes out a keystone species, this can be detrimental for the ecosystem. All right, and indicator species. These are also organisms that are important to determining the overall health of an ecosystem. So if an ecosystem, or I'm sorry, if an indicator species is either eradicated from an area or its population density decreases dramatically, this can indicate that the ecosystem's health, overall health, is either poor or it's becoming less healthy. So one prime example of that are amphibians. So we have amphibians like frogs and salamanders that actually absorb chemicals and various things right through their skin. And if there's an increase, we could say like in chemicals in an environment, those organisms would be one of the first type of species to actually absorb those chemicals, and then that would have detrimental effects on the population. So because these are one of the first things that are kind of harmed, we say that that's an indicator species. Kind of like if you've ever heard the phrase canary in a coal mine, miners used to wear little cages or carry cages around with canaries in them. And if the gases in the mine got too high, the poisonous gases in the mine got too high, the canaries would die, and that would tell the coal miners, "Gosh, we got to get out of here." That's an indication that the mine's not safe for us. And so it's very much the same thing with amphibians and like frogs and salamanders. They're an indicator that there's something wrong with an ecosystem. Usually, it's chemicals or some kind of nutrient maybe that's not present that should be there that causes a detriment to those amphibians. Okay, so again, indicator species can just tell us about the overall health of the ecosystem and whether or not there potentially was a disturbance in that ecosystem. Okay, so let's move on to our practice FRQ for 2.7. Based on this graph below, explain why spruce trees are considered an early, middle, or I guess what it actually says is explain whether spruce trees are an early, middle, or late successional species. So which is it? Defend your answer with evidence based on the graph here. And again, you can find the answer on OneNote. And if you have any questions, make sure that you talk to me in class. See you all later.